You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. My guest this week is the lovely Helen Fripp, whose latest novel, The Painter's Girl, whisks us back to Paris in the 1860s. Helen is drawn to strong women who defy societal pressures and the expectations of their time. In The Painter's Girl, we meet Mimi Bisset, born in the slums of Montmartre and forced to give up a child she had out of wedlock as a teenager. Mimi could easily have become a drunk, an absinthe addict, a sex worker, or all three, like so many around her. But Mimi's dreams are too big for her tiny corner of Paris, and were carried along as she joins a circus, becomes a muse to the great Impressionists, is reawakened as Edouard Manet's lover, and fights to become an artist in her own right. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce Helen Fripp, author of The Painter's Girl. Hello, Helen. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, it's great to be here, and I'm imagining I'm in Paris with you, even though I'm not.
We can imagine we're sitting outside on a terrace with a glass of wine, watching the people pass by.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect.
So can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm Helen Fripp, author of The Painter's Girl. And The Painter's Girl is set in late 19th century Paris, and it's around the Impressionists, the early Impressionists, so Renoir and Monet and Edouard Manet and the rest. I call them the gang because they were actually rebels. We think of them nowadays as kind of cosy paintings that maybe, our grandmas have got on their wall, but they were absolute rebels. People used to riot at their exhibitions, and apparently women fainted as well at some of the paintings. They were so shocking. So that's hard to believe today. So I kind of dropped the reader into this milieu. Everything was changing in Paris. It was changing from an old medieval town into the Paris that we know now with the wide boulevards. And into that, I drop my heroine, Mimi, who is a girl from the slums. But at that time, everything was changing. The classes were sort of crossing over. So for a girl like Mimi, who is full of ambition and wants to change and wants to move up, it's the perfect place to be. And you see her trials and tribulations. She wants to be an artist. She joins this gang of Impressionists, and the story unfolds.
Fabulous. Were they actually a gang? Did they all hang out together in the way that you...
We did. Yeah, they actually did. There were several hangouts that they had. One of them was in Montmartre, and it was called the Lapin Agile. And every evening, I think it was every Wednesday evening, the owner laid out a table for these artists, and they would have these raucous gatherings. And apparently the owner of the Lapin Agile was very good at making vol au vents. And so he'd make these vol au vents, lay them out on this long table. Cézanne, Renoir, Degas, Edouard Manet, Monet, all gathered along with various hangers-on, and, kind of debated the issues of the day. What can I say? Badmouthed the Académie des Beaux-Arts, which was the kind of artistic establishment of the time, despite the fact that they were all had one ambition, and that was to get into the Paris Salon. And if you got into the Paris Salon, then that was the way that you made money as an artist. And most of them were actually rejected. And so the Impressionists sort of came about because they held what they called a Salon des Refusés, and they held their own exhibition. And after that sort of came to fame. None of them had any money. They were all absolutely poverty-stricken, apart from my hero, Edouard Manet, who was a society man. But even he was working outside of his own society. So yes, it was fascinating times, fascinating gang. It seemed like so much fun, and I hope that I've portrayed that in my book. So yeah.
You absolutely have. Yeah, you get a sense of what it would have been like to be there, but it also does really make you want to have lived at that time and be at those tables with them and get to go on these adventures with them. It gives you a nostalgic wanderlust, if that makes sense.
Yes, I know what you mean. And I hope I haven't portrayed it as an easy time either, because of course, it was a time of absolute poverty for many people. But things, like I say, were changing, and actually trains made a huge difference at the time. So the Impressionists, a lot of them painted scenes from the Gare Saint-Lazare, these big steam trains that could kind of whisk you into the suburbs and into these beautiful kind of riverside locations that a lot of them painted further into the south. So many people who had never been really outside of their kind of 2 square miles were suddenly able to travel. So it was a time of great change.
And what is your connection to France or to Paris?
I love France. I'm a complete Francophile. It's funny, these things start just with a little spark. And in fact, I'm from a place in the UK called Bristol. And there was a Bristol-Bordeaux exchange, which I went on at the age of 13. Stayed with a French family who didn't speak a word of English. And I was unbelievably shy. I think I spent my whole time just kind of blushing and stumbling around. And came back. My mum made me call the family to thank them. And I opened my mouth and just all this French came out. So somehow it had gone in, and we made friends with that family. And so every summer I would go back. I was very lucky. They had a kind of a summer house in Montpellier. Then from there, I got a boyfriend in France. So I carried on going in my summer holiday. So that sort of started my love of France. And then later I studied French at university, and I worked in Paris for a little while. And stayed, actually, I was very lucky, in a hostel on the Avenue Georges V, of all places, and worked in a film production company. And then later in life, once I'd had my children, we went to live in Collioure, which is a beautiful little fishing village just near the border with Spain on the Mediterranean side. And the kids went to the local school and picked up French, and we stayed there for a year. So I've always had this kind of hankering to be in France. And somehow that translated into my writing. I think there's something about being a historical novelist and writing in another place that really appeals to me, and that, gives me that freedom that I need to just kind of go and imagine.
Wow, that sounds amazing. All of these different experiences that you had. It's very hard to imagine a hostel on the Avenue Georges V. It sounds like the swankiest place for a hostel.
It wasn't in any way swanky, I can assure you. It was very, very basic. I shared a room with a girl from Madagascar, and we became great friends. And I remember, I don't know why I particularly remember this about it. It was called the Foyer de Chaillot. I don't even know if it's still there, but every morning there was stale bread. And so the people that were serving it used to kind of sprinkle it with water to kind of make it a bit more palatable. And so we'd be eating this soggy bread, but very happily, we'd be walking out onto the Avenue Georges V and down the Champs-Élysées. So we thought we'd kind of died and gone to heaven.
Wow. That actually sort of reminds me of the disparity in this book between Mimi's life and Manet's life, for example.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there I was, absolutely, not a penny to my name, just finished university, and then walking out onto these boulevards. And so, yes, I haven't thought of that actually, but now you mention it, this feeling of walking out onto those wide boulevards and seeing it all for the first time really was so arresting. And I think anyone feels like that goes to Paris, that they're just the beauty of the place and how much beauty there is. It seems to never end. But of course, there was a different reality, and still is, like in any big city.
Well, I've compiled some questions for you. Your readers ask very interesting questions, so I've got a lot of really fabulous questions to ask you. The first one, I want to start with the very beginning of The Painter's Girl, because the opening scene is really bright and vivid. And it starts with the word zebra, or zebra, I suppose. And it's this zebra running down the boulevard of Montmartre. And then we're introduced to our heroine, the main character, Mimi, who manages to run up alongside the zebra and jump on its back and ride it off towards the circus. And it's such an incredible opening scene. I think it's one that will stick with me forever. Immediately, you're just jumped into this world. And I'd like to know where that image came from. Where did that idea come from?
Yeah, well, I guess every writer would kind of empathize with that staring at the blank page thinking, where do I start? And I knew that I actually based Mimi loosely on Suzanne Valadon, who was actually a muse of Toulouse-Lautrec's, and was a bit later than the period that I based my book in. But I just was so fascinated by this idea that she had been a trapeze artist at the age of 15 and then had fallen, and after that became a muse, then an artist in her own right. And so I knew I wanted a circus in it somewhere. And I started reading up about circuses, and I read up all about the trapeze and, you know, people's own experiences. And I think it was actually a circus in the US where there was a story about a zebra that had escaped. And so I thought, that's it. I've got it. That's the opening line. There's going to be a zebra on the Boulevard Montmartre. It's going to be kind of going wild and knocking everything over. And then in steps my heroine, Mimi, who is based on Suzanne Valadon and who actually worked in the stables and was apparently very kind of physically sure of herself and had lots of stamina and was very good with horses. So she can be really dynamic and brave and rescue this zebra and then tame it enough to be able to ride it down the Boulevard Montmartre. That was my opening, and I just so enjoyed writing it. I think I did it in one sitting.
Amazing. Did you do any first-hand research for your trapeze artist?
No, you know, I actually tried to, but I wrote the book mostly in a pandemic. So normally I really love going and having first-hand experiences, and I find it incredibly inspirational, and I love to walk the streets, but this wasn't possible. So I read up loads about trapeze artists, and it was so fascinating that apparently nearly every trapeze artist you ever speak to has this urge, almost like that urge you might get on the edge of a cliff to throw yourself off, to let go. So they really have to fight it, and apparently they've all had it at some point in their career, this feeling they just want to let go and see what happens, which sounded absolutely terrifying. So I've tried to capture that in my book, that, you know, that absolute danger. And in those days, a lot of them did operate without a safety net as well, to kind of add to the drama of the show.
That's terrifying. That's another fact I'll never forget. Every time I see a trapeze artist now, I'll think about their desire to let go.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah. So you tend to write books with strong female protagonists who defy these societal pressures and the expectations of their time, much like Mimi does. What is it that draws you to these stories and to these women?
I suppose, in a way, I'm a feminist. I'm in my 50s, and I grew up in a time of change for women, I suppose. And I quite often, you know, thank my lucky stars that I was born in the place I was at the time I was, because even compared to my mother and my grandmother, I've had so many chances and so many options to go out into the world and do exactly as I please. And that hasn't always been the case. And also history hasn't always been kind to these women who did that. And they're certainly not recorded. That, you know, recording a kind of greatness of the women throughout history has been kind of few and far between. And I think particularly I started reading up about the Impressionists, and I just was reading all these newspaper articles of the time. And there was one person in particular, I remember I was reading up about Toulouse-Lautrec again, and they said that one of his muses was a prostitute with two children and syphilis. And I thought, that poor woman, how absolutely awful. But to society, she was just finished. She was just a piece of dirt. I just wanted to put the record straight for these women. And in fact, my heroine, Mimi, is kind of an amalgam of lots of those girls. And well, you'll have to read the novel to find out what happens. But she certainly fights the society's rules of the time.
Are you searching for spiritual guidance? The Heart of You podcast is an exploration into your soul through intuition, spirituality, divination, and unconditional love. Host Annette Delou is a spiritual guidance coach, intuitive, Akashic, and tarot reader who discusses practical ways to integrate spiritual growth into your everyday life. Listen now to The Heart of You on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. Is there something autobiographical in these stories of these young women who undergo metamorphoses and find their feet and achieve their dreams?
Yes, I think there is. I have to admit, I've always kind of had a longing for something different. I think that's why I went to live in France, and it's only in later life that I found success as a writer. And I just always wanted to do something different and go somewhere different and be something different. So yes, maybe there has always been a longing. And like I say, even for someone of my generation, although I had a lot of options, I remember going to my careers advisor at school and they said, right, basically you can be a secretary or a teacher. And those were my two options. And I thought, well, actually, I'd really like to be a writer, but I didn't think that was open to the likes of me. So secretaries and teachers are brilliant people, don't get me wrong, but it's just, I kind of wanted more. I always wanted more. And so, yes, I suppose there is something maybe a little bit autobiographical about my characters.
Yeah, we definitely have more opportunities now, but there still is this reductive quality of society to say that you're only this or you're just this or you've reached this one label and that's the thing that you are forever.
Yeah, exactly. There's still a way to go.
Yes, there is. Can you talk a little bit about the research that you did for this book? You mentioned Suzanne Valadon, and she's very interesting to me. How were you able to find information about these women to craft Mimi from?
Well, I mean, when I first started out, I always buy lots and lots of books. I get interested in a subject and then I gather books. I have a whole library on the Impressionists now. And I really enjoy researching books. But obviously online there's a wealth of information as well. So mainly for this novel, in the writing of it, my research was based in books and online. But as soon as I could get on the Eurostar, I hopped onto it. And actually, I went to the Musée d'Orsay and I wanted to cry because I saw all these pictures that I'd been writing about and kind of studying in books and online. And there's just nothing like seeing it in the flesh. And it was just so wonderful to be back in an art gallery and back amongst people and walking the streets of Paris. So I did spend some time in Paris and use that to help me as well. And, you know, going to Montmartre, walking the streets, walking up the Butte. And actually at the time that I was writing, the Sacré-Cœur didn't exist because it was just before the Paris Commune. And so the Butte would have just been kind of shacks and chickens and vegetable gardens and really higgledy-piggledy. So it was, I just loved kind of walking those old cobbled streets who, you know, some of which will be the same as the period I was writing about.
Yeah, I loved reading about the paintings. These are paintings that I'm familiar with, a lot of them, especially living here. You know, these paintings come up a lot. But I did find myself Googling them again to look at them with fresh eyes when you were talking about how they were crafted and the people in them, and especially these women that maybe I would have just sort of glanced over, now trying to imagine the woman that stood there to pose for the actual painting itself.
Yes, I mean, I found that very inspirational as well. And reading about, you know, who these women were, you know, some of it is documented. And there were some little surprises as well. So one of the pictures I write about is Edouard Manet's A Bar at the Folies Bergère. And there's a scene where my protagonist, Mimi, gets on the swing at the Folies Bergère and kind of delights and shocks everybody with her exploits. And then I looked really closely at this picture, and just in the top left-hand corner, I'd never ever noticed it before, And I didn't notice it until I saw it in the flesh. There's just a tiny little pair of green slippers on a trapeze above the crowd at the Folies Bergère. And so that then features in my book. It was just like one of those serendipitous things. I just couldn't believe my luck because I'd already written the scene. And then there were these pair of little slippers, which in my book are Mimi's.
Wow. And what about Manet? So Mimi ends up meeting the Impressionists. She falls in love with Edouard Manet.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about the research that you did on him? And was there anything about him that particularly surprised you?
But before I started, we all know the name Monet, we all know the name Renoir. Manet was a bit confusing because, of course, there's Monet and Manet. Monet was a water lily person. Manet was quite different. And so, yes, I had kind of lumped them all together a little bit, these guys that kind of, painted sunlit picnics and kind of water lily scenes. But actually, Edouard Manet was much more of a Parisian. He tended not to do so much plein air painting. And he was just the kind of consummate Parisian, a society man, a kind of a golden boy. And he was a little bit older than some of the other Impressionists. So he was almost the founder of this movement. And so I didn't really know that about him. And also he was, like a lot of men in those days, he had an affair with his piano teacher and ended up marrying her. And his parents didn't know until his father died that he had married this woman and also had a child with her. His mother was very sympathetic and supported them, but it was so shocking to society that he would kind of marry, in inverted commas, beneath himself. But he couldn't tell anybody, and so he hid his poor wife and child for quite some time. And that story just keeps appearing again and again, and that theme runs through my book as well.
You mentioned this, you talked a little bit about this before, but can you talk about what it is that draws you to historical fiction? You said that there's a freedom in setting these stories in the past. Can you talk a little bit more about that and maybe what you find to be the most difficult part of writing historical fiction?
Yeah, I've always just loved historical novels. And again, I was sort of thinking back, what started me in all of this? And I remember at school, I was terrible at school, but I used to love history. And I remember my poor history teacher was tearing his hair out, thinking, what are we going to do with this girl? And he said to me, go and read a book. And it was called Queen in Waiting by Jean Plaidy. And I went and read it, and I was just so transported by this book. So that kind of, planted a little seed. And then as I got older, I'd go on holiday and go to art galleries or find out about the history of where you were, and always found that really fascinating. And then somehow I remember, I'd just be looking at a painting or something and imagining the story, and it would sort of start to kind of blossom in my head. And so then I started getting more into history and the idea of writing a historical novel. And then, there's just something so transporting about knowing what the kind of the pillars are. So I'm very, very careful about dates. And if I've got a backdrop of a war or, for example, the Impressionists, I'm very careful about being very accurate about it, because as a reader of historical fiction, I know that I always like to feel like I'm learning something. But then imagining in between what I call those pillars to myself, those absolute dates and those absolute happenings. What conversations did they have to get to that point? What happened behind the scenes? And that's what I really love to imagine. And that's where you can let your imagination run riot. But there is always a constraint to historical fiction, or at least in my life there is, of, getting the dates right. And there have been times when I think, particularly in this book, I'm writing about such household names, and I am taking liberties with them and imagining things and putting words into their mouths. That can be terrifying. That keeps me awake at night sometimes thinking, oh my God, there's going to be some academic that, pulls me up on something, and there's going to be scorn and derision poured upon me. So, that can be constraining as well as inspirational.
That makes sense to me, that fear of getting it wrong. But I think There's something to be said for doing the research, and especially with an artist getting to know their work. I think you get a sense of who the person is behind it, and then maybe you can imagine these conversations and these situations.
Yeah, I mean, I like to feel like I get to know these people so well through research and through looking at the social history as well, and letters and original source material, that I got to know them well enough to take the liberty of putting words in their mouths. But, sometimes I do use the words they actually used as well. So, I'm kind of weaving all the time.
Fabulous. Can you talk a little bit about your actual research process? So how much time do you spend researching versus writing? And then how do you decide what you leave in and what you take out so that it's not like an 800-page opus?
Yeah, I mean, that has evolved over time. So the first novel I wrote actually never got published, and I spent a very long time researching that. And it was set in kind of Venice and Cyprus, and I wasn't very organised about it. And so I ended up with this massive information. And then when it came to sitting down to write, I couldn't quite remember where I'd filed it, or I knew it was somewhere, but you can waste a lot of time like that. And I'm now on book number 4, and I've been so organised about this. I've got files, I've got spreadsheets, because I know when I come to sitting down and writing the book, I just need to be able to kind of grab it. And actually Kindles have been very useful in that way. Up until now, I've always used paper books, but Kindles for research are great because A, you can carry it around with you the whole time, and B, it's great for kind of making notes and emailing them to yourself. So I do a lot of research, an awful lot of research. And ideally, I go to places and I speak to curators and I speak to historians, and I file it all, and then I probably use 20% of it in my actual book. But it makes me feel good to kind of know the background and the social context. And again, coming back to putting those words into people's mouths, just to know that, I'm getting it as right as I possibly can. And then there's always a little detail like, oh, she struck a match. And then you think, did they actually have matches then? All those kinds of things, were there clocks? What kind of clocks were there? You can go down so many rabbit holes, which I find quite enjoyable, but it can slow you down a bit. And, my editor would probably get very frustrated with me if I went too far down that route. And also those rabbit holes can spark a whole chapter as well. So, it's kind of a fine line deciding how far you go. And of course, the big no-no for historical fiction writers is having your research sitting too heavily on the text, because ultimately people want to read a good story.
Right. It's not a textbook,
yes,
ultimately.
Exactly.
Yeah. And when you find yourself stuck or blocked or not sure where to go next, do you find yourself going back to the research, or do you find yourself going to something else for inspiration, like music or art or something like that?
It can vary. Sometimes I write everything on my laptop, and sometimes just stepping away from my laptop and taking a notebook somewhere can just free me up. But quite often, yes, I do. I go back into my research, or I research something new, just to kind of give myself a little bit more colour and a little bit more context. I mean, it totally depends on, where I am in the book. I remember I'd given myself, because I have a day job as well, so I'd given myself a holiday in order to go and write. And I remember I had 10 days, and I just got to this impasse. I could not get past it. And I think it was around, oh my God, they're so famous, and why am I writing this? And what right have I got to be writing this? And I just, for 5 of these precious 10 days that I had to kind of crack the backbone of the book, I just prevaricated. And so I spoke to my editor, and she just said, right, okay, take the rest of that holiday off, just go and enjoy yourself. And she actually gave me a spreadsheet and said, right, break each scene down into, each chapter down into 3 scenes, fill in this spreadsheet, and on you go, sort of in a slightly bored voice. She's probably heard it so many times before. And so that was really great, actually. I just took the time off, and of course I came back to it and, totally refreshed, and having a little bit of structure on it was fantastic, which I don't like it to be too structured at the beginning, but towards the end, once you've established all your characters and your research and everything, it is quite nice to have a bit of structure. And of course, you've got such a big entity that you're working with, sort of 70,000 words in, remembering what you've written at the beginning, you do have to be quite organised about it, or things don't match up at the end.
Is Paris the most romantic city in the world? Host Lily Heisey answers this very question in her podcast, Romancing in Paris, which takes you through the city, arrondissement by arrondissement, by exploring the most romantic and hidden spots Paris has to offer. Listen now to Romancing in Paris on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So I have a bonus question for you. Imagining a world in which we don't have to reanimate the dead to make this happen, which 19th century artist would you most like to have a meal with, and why?
We haven't talked about one of the female Impressionists, Berthe Morisot, who was an incredibly talented artist. And from all my research, she was one of those people you'd want to meet in your student flat. You know, she'd be lying there with a cigarette holder and, you know, darling, it's so lovely to see you, and kind of introduce you to this exotic new society world. And so that's kind of how I imagine her. And so I would love to have breakfast with her, because I think we'd kind of start breakfast, we'd gossip, we'd go and do a bit of shopping. She'd show me the sights, and I would be kind of initiated into this new world of decadence and art and society. So yeah, I'd have breakfast with Berthe Morisot. And I think I'd go for dinner with Claude Monet, because or quite often our view of him is this older man with a beard in his garden in Giverny, with a kind of a smock, painting all these beautiful paintings. But actually, when he was young, apparently they used to call him Lord Monet. He came from quite humble beginnings, but he had delusions of grandeur, that's for sure, when he got to Paris. And apparently just everything was on account. He was very extravagant. He always had the creditors one step behind him, but always managed to get away with it, to the point where apparently he used to wear these kind of big floppy white shirts and have his hair really long. And he ran up a massive bill with his tailors. And when his tailor asked him to settle up, Claude said, "I cannot believe you're just being disgusting enough to ask me for money." And the tailor apparently apologised and said that he was delighted to be working for him and let him off the whole bill. So he was that kind of person. So I think he'd be really good fun on a night out.
Would that worked for us all.
Yeah, he must have had a lot of charm and a lot of charisma.
Oh, it's a fascinating story. I did not know that about him. So I think you're going to read to us from The Painter's Girl. Is there anything that we need to know contextually before you do?
Yes, so the scene that I begin with in the excerpt from the book is based on Renoir's The Luncheon of the Boating Party. And it's this idyllic scene with all these beautiful young people in kind of singlets and silks and bonnets on a summer's afternoon having lunch. And it's obviously they've had their lunch, they're all chatting. And so I drop Mimi into this scene, and she's still quite new to this whole scene, and she's never been outside of Paris. So she describes this scene for us and introduces us to Renoir and Monet and some of the other artists. And then she goes back. She has aspirations to be an artist, and she doesn't dare tell anyone. So some of her longings are revealed through the paintings that she paints when she goes home as a result of this encounter with all these beautiful people.
The lunch at the Maison Fournaise was on a deck jutting out over the water, and it was packed with the artist's friends. There were muses, actresses, buyers, poets, writers and bureaucrats, and the conversation was loud and bawdy. Mimi joined in with the best of them, loving having an audience, and they in turn loved her. When the conversation lulled, she leaned back on the railings and surveyed the scene. Light dappled the beautiful crowd, picking out highlights on the girls' flowered bonnets, glinting on the silver salvers piled with peaches and swollen black grapes. The rumpled tablecloth was strewn with crumbs, and the wine bottles and glasses distorted and mellowed the late afternoon light. "You are baptized and emerged Queen of Montmartre," Monet had declared expansively. Was it possible to cleanse yourself of the past, of misery and deprivation? It felt like it was. like she really had been baptised into a new beginning as she snuggled deeply into Edo on the train home, the world rushing by as if it wasn't real. Perhaps she'd even be like the dark-haired woman in Edo's picture, with her floaty boulevard girl posh dress, someone people respected, someone who could provide her daughter with a good home. "I'll walk home from here," she said to Edo at the Gare Saint-Lazare. She didn't explain. Today had been too nice. He'd followed her with his eyes, full of desire all day, proud when she held the crowd at the luncheon party. But it was important not to get too attached to anything too good. That night she fell asleep remembering the way the water had cradled and rocked her, and longed to have her hand on Colette's crib, to be the river that would envelop and support her, take her gently downstream on life's journey through torrents and storms, her wide-eyed little mermaid, dark curls caught in the sun. She applied the gesso and set it aside to let it dry, then grounded a primed canvas with pale golden tint. Propping a mirror in front of her, she drew a self-portrait in sharpened charcoal. She looked at herself and imagined Edo to see what he saw. Her features softened, her eyes glowed, and the ghost of a smile turned up the corners of her mouth. "Careful," she said to her reflection. There were 2 paintings she had to create, and a week, maybe 2, crept past almost unnoticed before she stepped back and contemplated them, satisfied. The first, epic in scale, was her, emerging from a river in a white dress. Edo was John the Baptist, and Monet and Renoir were acolytes, holding up white sheets ankle-deep in the cleansing river. Mimi didn't believe in God, but churches were peace and power at the same time, and Jesus understood the ecstasy and agony of people brought up on the streets. "A new beginning," said Mimi to the mirror. In this picture, she wasn't a grisette from Montmartre playing to the crowd. She was the central figure, serious and optimistic, emerging into a new world. That the other artists were bit players in her picture was significant. It was only on canvas that she could take such prominence against men. The second picture was a finished piece in oils and much smaller, the size of a handkerchief. It was a painting of a mother cradling a child in christening robes above a stone church font. The young mother looked adoringly down at her baby's pristine face, the rest of the world shut out in their circled gaze. A haze of votive candles lit the backdrop, rendering smudged halos of hope with their flames. When Colette was baptised by her new family, Mimi had sneaked into the shadows at the back of the church and watched the congregation of fine citizens accept Colette into their society in a way she could never hope to be. Her daughter had screamed blue murder the entire time, and it had taken everything she had to stop herself from snatching her out of Jean-Baptiste's arms and soothing her like only a mama could.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. So what is next for you? Do you have another book in the works?
I do. In fact, I just managed to get myself another couple of months in my beloved France, in the south this time, just near Fréjus in the foothills of the Alpes-Maritimes. And this time it's going to be a World War II novel, or set in the World War II. And it's based on a young boy whose favourite book is The Little Prince, one of France's favourite children's books, and Saint-Exupéry, who was a World War II airline pilot, and an amazing woman called Marie-Madeleine Forçard, who headed up the resistance for a while in southern France. So all of these lives are going to be woven together with a backdrop of World War II. And that's as far as I've got so far, but I've done lots of research, and this time it's been wonderful to go to Saint-Tropez, to explore all these wonderful little villages in the Alpes-Maritimes. And actually, I was very lucky in the village that I was in. There was a little museum, and the curator of the museum just happened to have interviewed every single person in that village who had been involved with the resistance and archived it all. So wow. I spent every week, he set me up a trestle table in this museum and set all these archives out in front of me, photographs, first-hand testimonies, and just left me to it. So, I mean, that's been a wonderful experience, and I hope that I can do it justice, because there are obviously some very sad stories in there too.
Wow, it's like a treasure trove.
Absolutely. I just couldn't believe my luck when I met this guy in the museum. So yes, I'm just kind of sitting down to plan that now, and that's going to be out in early 2024.
Fabulous. Sounds very interesting, all these different characters. I will definitely look forward to it. And if people want to keep in touch with you to learn what you're up to now and what's coming next, where can they find you?
So I have a website, which is helenfrippauthor.com, and I'm on social media. So you can find me on Facebook at hfrippauthor, Twitter at Helen Fripp, or Instagram Helen Fripp Author. And I love hearing from my readers. So please, if you've got any questions or you just want to say hello, please do.
Fabulous. And I'll include links to everything so people can find you very easily.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much, Helen. It was a real delight speaking with you. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you again to Helen Fripp for such a fabulous conversation. You can find Helen at helenfrippauthor.co.uk, on Facebook and Instagram at Helen Fripp Author, and on Twitter at Helen Fripp. Please join me next week when my guest will be author David Hoon Kim. Check back next week to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from his book, Paris is a Party, Paris is a Ghost. If you'd like to keep the conversation going, please join the Storytime in Paris book club, where you'll meet a different guest author each month and get to speak with them directly about their work. For more information, please visit patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria, and on my website, jennyphoria.com. Storytime in Paris is produced by me as part of the Paris Underground Radio podcast network. To check out interviews with previous guests or to discover more great Paris-based podcasts, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thank you, and until next time, happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.